Greetings, everyone, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for joining RedRisks Live. Now, this is a follow-on from part one last week, where we had an interview with Dave Snowden on Cynefin. But before we get going, three things that I do want to share with you. It's a live show. Gremlins are inevitable, so please bear with us while we knock them down if they do turn up. The other thing is that this is a live show where we actually invite you to support by clicking and subscribing to the YouTube channel and also sharing it with folks out there, because by sharing, you're not only caring, but also allowing us to reach further out into the network. And finally, there is live chat. So please do join in, take part. We may not be able to answer all the questions, but what we will do is we'll park them up and we'll cover them at the end. And also there is an email at the top, live@redrisks.com, where you can get in touch with me and I will field those questions afterwards. So last week was a very exciting week for me. In fact, I think one of my colleagues on the show described it very perfectly, that Dave Snowden has been living rent-free in his head with all the discussions. He's certainly been doing that with mine as well, because I haven't been able to stop thinking about Cynefin. So the format for the show today is very straightforward. I'm going to introduce you to Dave again, and also to some of the colleagues who are going to be joining me from various parts of the world. And then we're going to go into part one, very quickly, just a quick overview, because there's no point repeating part one. Please catch that on the YouTube channel. Then we're going to do a deeper dive into the dynamics and the flow between the different domains in the framework, the Cynefin framework. And then an open discussion with my colleagues and with yourselves on live chat. And then let's set the scene for part three, where we go really deep and look at application of the Cynefin framework in terms of risk and safety management. Last but not least, a quick closeout where we can catch some thoughts as well. So without further ado, let me get Dave on the show and also some of my colleagues and introduce you all one by one. So Dave, a very, very warm welcome. How are you today?
Hi, fine, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us today. I just want to introduce you to some of my colleagues. There's no particular order. Firstly, Charlie. Charlie's in Riyadh, and he's managing one of the biggest projects out there, which is the BRT, and about 3,000 plus people on there. Charlie, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Sonny. Delighted to meet you, Professor Dave. Thank you.
And next is Terry Mathis, my good friend from the US. Terry is a legend in this world of health and safety, because he's written lots and lots of books. He's won awards with the American Society of Safety Professionals. And Terry, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Sonny. Good to meet you also. And interested in a number of the things that you've been talking about. Wondering if you knew some of the people that I knew at IBM too. Maybe we'll get a chance to chat about that at some point in the future.
Well, they still want to know me or not, which is the question with IBM. You can get the person of IBM, but you can quite get the IBM of the person.
And I just want to introduce you to Mal as well. Mal's in Wales, so we thought we'd get someone on from Wales for you, Dave, so you can talk in a language that none of us can understand. But there you go. Mal, welcome to the show.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Sonny. Hello, Dave. Nice to meet you again. Afternoon, Charlie. You're in sunny Riyadh, no doubt. Terry, Terry, we have spoken before, but quite a few years back.
Good. And Mal's actually a subject matter expert in renewable energy. In fact, there isn't a sector that Mal hasn't worked in. He keeps telling us about nuclear and all sorts of other things. We were expecting one other guest today, Dave, Dr. Dominic Cooper from the US, but Dom's in the middle of house moving, so he wasn't sure if he was able to join us. His specialty is a world leader in behavioral safety, and I'm sure we would have some really engaging discussions in there. Now, let me set some context here. So that's an introduction to the group here. We have got live chat as well. So if questions are coming up on live chat, I'm going to flick them to the end, because I want to keep the continuity of the show going. And my way of summing up part two is this picture, which Dave will instantly recognize. I'm not going to tell you who it is now, but I'll tell you at the end as a quiz. But it's the calling of St. Matthew by a very, very famous painter. And the connection between this and the show today, which is Cynefin Essentials, will become fairly apparent as Dave opens up the conversations in terms of, well, I'm going to leave that for a couple of minutes. Let's talk about what happened last week. And Dave, I always say to myself, if I can't go back and talk about what I discussed with my guests or what my guests share with me, then I have to go back to the drawing board and learn a little bit more. And as Charlie rightly put it, you've been living rent-free in my head in terms of Cynefin, trying to get my head around some of the language, the flow, the dynamics, and certainly not say the word model again. I can't guarantee I won't say it again, but if it does, I'm sure it's on the downward path in terms of being mentioned. Framework. Okay, so there are 5 domains, and the first is clear. And I'm just going to go verbatim with what's on the scene: sense, categorize, respond, fixed constraints, and best practice. Best practice being past practice, I guess. In the next domain, complicated, we talked about sense, analyze, respond, which is about governing constraints and about good practice. Then the next domain is complex, which is enabling constraint. It's about probe, sense, respond, and it's about exaptive practice. Exaptive about the biological expression in terms of birds growing feathers and evolving. And I said, go back to the show 1, it will tell you a little bit more about that. And last on this side is chaotic, the domain which is all about act, sense, respond, no effective constraint, and it's a novel practice. Mustn't forget the domain in the center, which is confused. And you talked about it being in two aspects, which is aporetic and in terms of confused. And I just want to give people a bit of context on this. Aporetic is, the Oxford English Dictionary defines it as to be at a loss, impassable, and inclined to doubt or to raise objections. Now, I want to park it up there and come to you about a word that you mentioned last week, Dave, and really open it up from there in terms of liminal, which is about thresholds and occupying a position in there. This show is about flow, dynamics. Last week, we understood about the different domains, but can you maybe discuss with us a little bit more about the dynamics that are involved and the flow that's involved and how you came up with liminality, the concept of it?
Okay, so liminality partly arose because people couldn't get the concept of dynamics. So Cynefin in its earlier instance had 5 domains and then a series of dynamic shifts. Right, so for example, the most stable dynamic is to start off with safe to fail experimentation in the complex domain. Yeah, that gradually creates some sort of stability. It becomes complicated, which means we can scale. And that's a good move, all right? The trouble is the context may shift. So something which did stabilize may no longer be stable. So the minute it's no longer stable, you move it back into complex. So the most stable dynamic was effectively complex, complicated, complex, and keep that going. Yeah. It's a sort of regular cadence. A small amount of material would stabilize sufficiently that you could move it into clear. So there was an arrow which then went down there. So that was kind of like the sort of standard one. Yeah. We then had 2 other dynamics. One was called a shallow dive into chaos. So that's if you leave things incomplicated too long. So you thought it was stable, you thought you had good practice, but actually you get an increase in people having to do more and more workarounds to get it to work. So one of the things, for example, you see in safety, and we can go into this possibly more next week, is one of the things we're finding is that actually safety regulations often cause more accidents and more mental stress than the job itself, because the system has become over-constrained. It doesn't recognize reality. Yeah. And therefore you need occasionally a sort of radical reset. Yeah. And that was called a shallow dive into chaos. And we also identified this move by which nothing ever really gets out of complex. It's like a sort of perpetual alpha. Nothing ever stabilizes, and you're seeing that increasingly in a whole variety of areas in politics and elsewhere. So those are the basic dynamics. The trouble is, people just didn't get it. So, you know, I've got domains, I've got dynamics. Some people got it, but 2 classification systems confuse people. And the sort of inspiration to change this, and we still have the dynamics, but it's easy to handle liminality, is I was actually looking at Caravaggio's painting 7 Mercies. That's where the idea came from. So the concept of shade and light and contrast, and suddenly I remembered a whole bunch of stuff from anthropology and elsewhere, which is basically about liminality, i.e. a state of suspended transition. So if you look at it in anthropology, what actually happens is if somebody dons a mask in a so-called primitive society, there's a state of liminal transition between them being who they are and being what the mask represents. In a modern environment, this is also quite critical, for example, in safety. So we've done pioneering work by getting people to, for example, strap on heated belts before they started to unload trucks. Yeah, as a way of ritualizing a change, to change a cognitive activation pattern. If you see emergency crews, they think differently about the world when they put on their uniform, yeah, than when they don't have the uniform on. So there's a whole body of stuff around this. So liminality is a state of suspended transition. And that then became easy. It took about a year to get it to the point where it was one single green line. Yeah. Cynefin is designed to pass the back of a table napkin test. If you can't draw it on a table napkin from memory, it kind of like doesn't serve the function of sense making. So we drew the line, and basically it gives me 4 separate liminal domains. So one is the complex to complicated transition. And that's where I've done my parallel safety experiments among multiple hypotheses. And now I've got a degree of stability, but there's some ambiguity left. So I start to move to linear iteration to get it right. In IT terms, that's where Scrum fits in.
Right.
Scrum is the perfect technique for this. And of course, the goal of that is to hold it in until you're sure before you commit to the move over into complicated. So that's that limit.
Sorry, Dave. Can I interrupt? So Scrum is an iterative process, isn't it? It's based on sprints, backwards, product backlog, blah blah blah, and carry through and keep going backwards and forwards. Yes. Yeah,
but the point is, it's a linear process. It's a short cycle thing. It handles ambiguity.
Right.
So to give you a contrast, the pre-Scrum technique in IT development would be what we call trios. Right. So we have a young person, a coder, together with a systems architect, together with a user trained to talk to IT people. Yeah, that's called a trio. And we throw 30 trios at a problem over a week rather than sending out one systems analyst. So what we're doing is massive parallelism to make sure we don't miss the gorilla, going back to what I talked about last week.
Yeah.
Yeah. Once you decided, well, kind of like this is where we want to be, then things like Scrum technique. Yeah, they handle a limited amount of ambiguity, but not total ambiguity. Yeah, so that's kind of like the difference. The liminal domain in the complicated, which is very small, if you look at it, that's actually where you have conflicting expertise.
That's this area here where the mouse is now floating. Right. Okay.
So the EU handbook on chaos and complexity, which we're just finishing off at the moment, this is actually quite an important domain, because if you look what happened in COVID, you had a massive conflict between epidemiology and behavioral science.
Right.
And both of them had different views on what should happen. So if I'm the decision maker, and remember, Cynefin is always from the decision maker's perspective, I've got competing expert groups. Yeah. Now I can't afford to choose one or the other. Neither can I afford to carry on too long. So this is where we start to use, and I can go into this later if you want, techniques like triopticon, which basically put people into highly ritualized short-term conflict. And the decision maker can observe the conflict and observe the response before they make a decision. Yeah. So there are techniques in that area, but it's a specialist area. So you know the experts have got the solution, but you don't know which experts or which combination, and you've got to sort it out fast. Yeah.
Dave, sorry to interrupt again. I've got a couple of slides. I've taken the liberty of watching some of the videos and taken an extract of a couple of the slides off there. If I show you them, if they help a bit more, let me know. Otherwise, I'll come back to this slide. So the ones that I've got are these. And so I've got these two in the back pocket.
I think you're probably better coming back to those in a second, right? So just hold them for a minute.
Right.
You've there. So, and I'll come back to that. The last one. So you've then got the shift into chaos. So that's the domain between complex and chaos.
Okay.
Now remember, chaos in Cynefin is never a stable state because it's a state of having no constraints. Yeah. And humans don't tolerate that sort of environment. If we get randomness, we do something about it fast. Ironically, the physicists hate me for this, although my background is physics. Complex has lower energy cost than chaos in human systems. Yeah, to maintain something with no connection between the parts takes a hell of a lot of energy in a human system. And that's where we do things like wisdom of crowds. So we're just doing a big one of those at the moment, for example, on climate change, which is initiating tomorrow, where we're presenting a series of potential solutions or ideas about what we can do to localize a global issue. And we presented
Sorry, Dave, the wisdom of crowds analogy that you gave before was a submarine, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that's a good one. So it's the same principle. So what we're doing is we're presenting to 1,000 people. They all interpret the same data in the same half hour in real time. And the interpretation is in what's called high abstraction metadata. So nobody knows what the right answer is, so they can't game it, which also creates a cognitive load. We use this, by the way, same thing in measuring aptitudes to safety. It's the same principle. Yeah? You don't want people to know what the right answer is. And that's the way that I can draw what are called fitness landscapes, so I can find the people who are thinking differently about the problem. So remember in the gorilla thing, 17% actually see the gorilla, but the other people don't listen to them. So this is a way of making that visible. Yeah. And that then leads us on to the final liminal domain, which is aphoretic, which is what your slide was about. And the basic principle is if you have an absolute crisis or you're very confused, you shift it into the aphoretic. And aporia, the dictionary definition isn't a good one.
Yes, you're right.
It's really derived from Derrida and also from rhetoric. So Derrida says, a decision isn't a decision if you know what to do. Right? It's just a process. So, and in rhetoric or in philosophy, it's a paradox. So it's an unresolvable way of looking at the problem. Because if I present a problem in which you can't simply resolve it, you have to think differently about the problem. So an example would be the famous liar's paradox, where I go into court and say, I always lie. Well, that means I just lied. So that means you see what I'm doing with that? Yeah. Or Zeno's paradox. Yeah. So the point about a paradox or an aporia is it prevents you going down a stable route. So you've got to think differently. So the way we use that domain is, having got into it, you have to decide what aspects of the problem go into the different areas. Some may go complicated, some may go liminal complicated, some may go complex, and some may go into that liminal area with chaos. And whether you go around that circle clockwise or anti-clockwise, if you've got massive ambiguity and you don't even know what the hypotheses are, you start off with a mass sense, that distributed intelligence. If you're finally fairly certain, you go the other way around. You get the experts involved where they can be involved quickly, and move around to just leave the intractables. So that's. But when you
apologies, when you go anti-clockwise, basically you're getting more into the ambiguity, aren't you? The ability to.
The other way around. But if you go anti-clockwise, what you're basically saying, well, the first thing we'll sort out is what the areas in this crisis where we should have bloody well listened to the experts.
Right.
Right now, I do not blame politicians for not listening to epidemiology warnings about plagues, because we've known about the possibility of plagues for the last 50 years. Yeah, and you can't plan every day on the assumption there will be a plague, right? But then there was one, right? And there's going to be worse coming, all right? So at that point, you say, okay, epidemiologists come in. What do we need to do? Here's the money. Here's the authority. Go do it. That's a shift into complicated. Yeah.
Can I just take a step back to the epidemiologists versus the behavioral psychologists and so on, which you put into the small area here in aphoretic, and this is where you get experts who basically don't agree. Is that right? And then okay.
So you're going to move stuff into complicated where there's no question which group of experts you should pay attention to.
Right.
Right, so that you just get rid of that set of problems. Then you've got competing bodies of expertise. Now, interestingly, I mean, I do a fair amount of military decision support. You see a lot of this in combat. Yeah, it's not that you can challenge people's expertise, but there are different perspectives on the problem. And I say the epidemiology, the behavioral science is kind of like a classic one. Yeah. So basically, you don't want to have some of that, but if you do have it, you need to ritualize the conflict, and it needs to take place very quickly, because you don't want to get into a lobbying group or people taking in trained positions. We've done a lot of work on this. If you actually have a lot of argument and a lot of discussion and a lot of meetings, people become more and more entrained in the way they look at the problem. So rather than let that happen, you break it into a short cycle ritual process quite early on. Yeah.
So
go on. No, so if you're going around anti-clockwise, you get rid of those two problems first. Then you've got a whole bunch of stuff where you've got multiple competing hypotheses between all sorts of different groups. Well, that's complex, that's experimentation. And if you don't know that you've covered all the hypotheses, that's going into that liminal domain with chaos.
Okay.
Yeah?
I've been jumping in with questions. Of course, if any of my colleagues and guests want to ask a question as well, feel free. If I may just take a second now, I've got a question from Mark Donnelly here, who's, I'm going to put it up, and he's saying, be careful contributing or correlating rules with an increase of failures. So I'm not sure if I understand that question, but what do you understand?
I know what you're talking about. The problem you got is that we've found this in multiple projects now, because most safety regulations are designed on the assumption that incidents take part in the center of a normal distribution.
Yes.
Now, the trouble is, in hospitals, for example, that's true of single morbidity situations, but the minute you move into multiple morbidity, you're in the tails of a Pareto distribution.
Can we come on to that? That's certainly for show 3, where we're going to talk about Gaussian and Pareto distribution and the fat tail, because that, to me, show 3 is really very, very pivotal. It's a great way of looking at risk, robustness, and resilience.
Because I know where Mark's coming from. The secret, Mark, is to have a rule about when the conventional rules don't apply,
right,
and have heuristics that apply when that isn't the case. So that it's not that you lose structure, but you have a different type of structure.
And heuristics meaning that it'll be more in the complex domain then, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so the American Marines, if the battlefield plan breaks down, capture the high ground, stay in touch, keep moving. Yeah, and we've done that work in a lot of firms, is you create heuristics that people follow if they have to break the rules, because the reality is you have to break the rules. That's just life. Yeah.
Last week I asked you a question, and upon hindsight, I realized now that it wasn't a very good question. I said to you, well, which is the best domain to be in? And you said, well, there isn't really a best domain. You're going to be in flow between all of them, aren't you? And while in fact, to be honest with you, Dave, since last Tuesday, every time I do something, I'm thinking about these domains. It's sort of stuck in my head. So I think when you look at, and the pandemic is a classic example, and you've given there about the epidemiologists not agreeing with the behavioral people. Should we be concerned about this then, that there is no consistency between experts as well, and we seem to be drifting between these?
No, you shouldn't be, because it's part of life, all right? I mean, it's also the way science progresses. We move into a context that we didn't know, we discover anomalies, right? And when we find anomalies, existing convention doesn't work and we have to rethink a bit. So it's not a surprise when the world, I mean, even a simulation doesn't do this, when the world faces a worldwide pandemic, that you haven't got a single school of thought about what you should do. And you've also got massive political interference. So you've got huge amount of money and political support going to herd immunity. Although there's very little support for that in any medical environment. And then things have emerged. So, for example, we now know a lot of stuff about COVID targeting genetic weakness. We know that one of the reasons why some Asian countries may have had more success is actually COVID seems to be more prone to attack people with Neanderthal genes. And that's true in Europe, but not in Southeast Asia. So you start to get more and more knowledge when you face something you've never seen before, and that's going to bring different groups of expertise into the problem. Right? So, and behavioral economists are a particular problem in their own right, if you want my view. But yeah, you've got to find a way in which, from a decision maker's point of view, you're not forced to choose who's right or wrong until you've heard them in a short-term ritualized environment, and you've also heard what other experts who surround the experts think, which is actually what we do with a triopticon.
Right. Okay.
I might go through this next week, but it's basically 3 experts discuss. Then a group of semi-experts discuss what the discuss happens, and you start to keep bringing these backwards and forwards. But you don't allow a stable pattern. You deliberately force the thing not to stabilize until everybody's voice has been heard, and then you make a call.
Before we dive into the other slides, I just want to take a sense check with Charlie, Terry, and Mal. Any thoughts on this so far from any of you?
Well, sorry, on you go, Terry. You first. On you go.
Oh no, that's fine. One of the things that I run into regularly in safety is people facing problems that they haven't faced before. terribly oversimplifying them, and that they're all looking for clear, what you're calling clear solutions. They're looking for linear solutions. Well, if we only do this, if we simply did that, then we could eliminate that. And I find so often it's not true. And their problem isn't as much, to my thinking, in problem solving as it is in problem identification. They're out there trying to solve the wrong problems. That they have not defined the problem well, and certainly not in a framework like you're presenting here. And that's where I see the real potential of this in safety.
It is, I think, because you can predetermine rules for how you'll behave. So you have rules about which type of rules you use, and that makes it easier for people. So if you can say, well, we agree, the way we create Cynefin is often by using exemplar narratives from the organization's own history, because that's how people argue anyway. So we can actually look backwards over history and say this aspect of this situation was complex. Then if the new situation is like that, we agree it's complex, right? Who's got hypotheses? Let's experiment. Not where do we apply best practice. So you try and create that economy of decision making. It was interesting. One of the things I'm quite proud of, there was a SWAT team in the US, and they actually drew Cynefin on the back of a concrete wall with a rusty nail before, and decided the problem was complex. Therefore they were probed, not follow a standard procedure. They phoned up command and said, it's complex, we're probing. Nobody argued with them because they used Cynefin strategically well. Right now, that was the fact it could be used at a strategy level and an operational level. And the napkin test was clear there. The guy literally scratched it on the wall. There's some hospitals in New Zealand which have it on the wall of operating theatres. So literally the surgeons use it to do a check before they make a decision if it's not usual.
Okay, Charlie, did you had a question?
Yeah, I'm very new to this, as we said earlier on, and I was pronouncing it wrong and calling it Cynefin and things like that. So I've been learning pretty quickly over the last couple of weeks. And from my perspective with this, Dave, I've been looking at things that we've done here. This is a massive project. A lot of people, 7,000 at peak, multiple languages and everything else like that going on. And I've been looking at large areas of what we've done and sort of analysing it against the framework, the detail, things like the complicated one where it's sense, analyze, and respond. You're looking for an expert and things. So from my perspective, I've been looking at this from a construction project perspective and seeing if the framework and the content within those domains actually is applicable to what we're doing here. And what I'm finding is, even at this limited knowledge, I can see that this works, and I'm sure you don't need my validation on that, but I can certainly see the aspect of this working within these large, complex construction projects that we have with multiple levels of people, multiple levels of intellect, different languages, and people spread across, and that aspect of what you were saying, where you can actually do it on the back of a napkin, or you can do it at a strategic level, on an operational level, or even just within a small group. I think it's extremely important, particularly with regards to what I do.
One thing I'm proud of is people have used the framework without us teaching them how to use it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's important, because if people can intuitively get it, I mean, Cynefin gets more sophisticated as you get deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
But at a certain level, anybody can get it and use it. All right. So which I think is one of the important aspects. There is some work we're doing at the moment. We've been talking with the Prince 2 guys about using Cynefin to create a complex systems approach to project management.
All right. Good.
And there's an INCOSI session coming up on this shortly as well, because the trouble is if you look at Prince 2 or you look at the PBOK stuff in the States, it assumes problems are complicated and failure is as a result of failure to follow process or root cause. Now, the more you get into complexity, there is no such thing as a root cause. It's a meaningless concept. Yeah, and therefore root cause analysis, you have to rethink radically. Now, that doesn't mean that you stop doing it when you do it. We're looking there at the work we did on counterterrorism, for example, moving that across, which is continuous monitoring through multiple agents so that you can see patterns of project divergence before they're reported through project management.
Dave, can I take you a step back? That comment you made about root cause, it's one of those things that it's a big battle that goes on in social media and LinkedIn and posts and everything else on. Can you elaborate on that a little bit further, just to add some context?
Yeah, and I mean, I can give you an example. Nobody would ever talk about it in terms of managing a party of their kids or managing their children. We don't talk about root causes there. We actually know there are multiple factors in play.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, the way I often explain this is imagine you've got a bunch of electromagnets in a circle on a table. And in the middle of the table, you've got some cast iron hockey pucks. Yeah. And there is a high coefficient of resistance before anybody gets petty with me. But some people get very pedantic about metaphors, right? So if all the magnets keep the same strength and polarity, the hot cast iron pucks will form a solid pattern. If I change one magnet, I can predict what will happen. If I change two magnets, I can predict what will happen. If I change three magnets, I can't anymore. It's a three-body problem. Yeah. So in a complex adaptive, these are called modulators. In a complex adaptive system, you may have 1,000 modulators, all of which are interacting and operating on the space. Now, the key thing, and this is where the real-time feedback comes in, if I can control enough of those magnets, I can influence what happens. But it's a real-time feedback loop. Yeah, it's like riding a bicycle or flying an aircraft. You're handling a few controls which keep the thing stable. And that's where we're going on the project management side. In a multi-modulated system, you ain't got root causes, but you can manage the modulators and you can manage the constraints.
We've got a question from Mark, but before we do that, the idea of modulators is interesting and sort of drivers on. Some may argue that when you consider the iron filings, they're not actually sentient beings. And you talked last week about Heisenberg's uncertainty. There's always that element of uncertainty, isn't there, with human beings? And is that why we're not doing root cause?
That's why I talk about anthro complexity and contrast it with the computational complexity you'll find at Santa Fe and elsewhere. I mean, the way I put that is human beings aren't ants, which rather upsets a lot of computer models. Because
I'm sure it does, yeah.
Models to work. So human beings have intelligence, identity, and intent.
Right.
And those three factors you don't see in insect populations. So what that means is you've got an extra level of complexity on a human system. And this is partly an answer to Mark's question, right? Lorentz butterfly effect is actually what's called a strange attractor. So it's a constant, you can see a pattern, even though the agent never passes the same way twice, but there's a pattern in the transactions. Now in human beings, and this is the big work we do, is the street narratives, the water cooler stories form a strange attractor. And people can't escape those stories. Right? And I mean, it's called a trope or an assemblage or a strange attractor, depending on which theoretical base you come from. But part of the issue you got with something like Trump in the States is you've got a dominant narrative pattern which operates like a strange attractor, and people can't escape from that attractor. And it acts as a filtering mechanism. It's why I hate the idea of memes, because memes is a classic root cause concept. Yeah, there's this thing which is seeking to replicate itself, and that's just not the case. What you've got is this pattern of multiple interactions, which has formed a pattern, and it's very difficult for people to escape it.
Okay, so Mark's question was that one. We've also got, sorry, Mal, I cut across rudely. Did you have anything you want to add? Because we've gone, John.
I was just going to, I suppose, elaborate on what Charlie had already touched on very, very lightly, and that was the Cynefin framework itself. Actually give us some areas where it is suited to, industries, domains, etc. Because I've watched a few of your videos now, and you do say in one or two of them that it's suited to all of them. It may well be, but give us some examples of that, of where it's been applied and where it's working very well, particularly in our industries. If we're talking about oil and gas, renewables, utilities, nuclear, etc., etc.
Okay, so I mean, first of all, I'd be far more careful. I don't think I'd ever say it works everywhere. My standard response to that question is, if you can think of a situation which isn't ordered, complex, or chaotic, then yes, it won't work there.
Right.
So that's how I put it. Right.
So that doesn't leave much for the thought, does it?
Because remember, Cynefin is drawn from. I mean, the whole approach I do, which is called naturalizing sense making, is we don't derive theory from empirical observation. We actually derive theory from natural science, and we use that as a constraint, and we experiment within those constraints. So that's a very different approach, and it handles uncertainty better. Because case-based approaches are really dangerous in the conditions of uncertainty. If you have a look on Google Scholar, you'll find, I mean, I'd say loads of people have used it. So, I mean, the ones I love are the British Cabinet Office using it to explain the role of religion in the Bush White House. That's actually written up as an article, how they did it.
You got Terry laughing there.
Which is actually, I mean, that's a fun article. It's on our website, all right? We've seen it, I'm going to say we've seen it extensively using people like Boeing, all right, in terms of decision support, in terms of safety. So we've seen it in manufacturing. It's huge in health. Because
let me try and make it a bit simpler then, if I can. And that is then, are there any examples where the framework is not appropriate or suitable?
I think if everything you did was in one domain, yes.
Is there such a thing as something in one domain? Because that goes back.
I'm going it back to Mel. I'm not getting involved in this.
Oh, okay.
Anybody's going to come and talk to me about a problem which is entirely in the audit domain, because they can go to big six consultancies where they spend their lives. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I think what is interesting. I mean, this is I blogged about this recently on what's called apex predator theory.
Yeah.
Which is during periods of massive discontinuity, and you get those when whole industries fall, and we're getting them now. People are open to novel ideas. They're not open to novel ideas between those periods.
Yeah.
So politically, sorry, go on.
If I may, if we take this question from Rakesh, can we move? I think you're going to touch on those other slides in a minute about moving between the different. Am I right in thinking that?
I'll answer one for Rakesh. So, I mean, I think it depends who you talk with, all right? There is definitely a massive difference between complexity theory, cybernetics, and system dynamics.
Yeah. And
it's systems dynamics and cybernetics which dominate what people mean when they talk about systems thinking. That's where you see it in business process re-engineering. You see it in Peter Senge. And everybody forgets that Senge's background is an engineering background, right? And all of those systems assume causality, right? So to me, the massive divide is complexity says there are systems which have no linear causality.
Right.
Yeah, they're dispositional. So it's quite easy to explain in China or India, because their religions say something just are. There's no reason for it. But we always think there has to be a reason in the West.
I think what you can hear in the background, by the way, is Charlie's. There's a call to prayers because he's in Riyadh.
Oh yeah, you can hear. All right, yeah.
That's all right. Yeah.
Sorry, Dave. Go ahead.
Saudi Arabia last year, and what was a traumatic experience. But so I think there are some people who want systems thinking to encompass complexity, and I think that's meaningless. Because then you've homogenized the field, right? The reality is, to me, the difference between causality and non-causality is so fundamental. You can't put disciplines in the same bracket. Yeah? But that is controversial. I don't think there's any controversy except for a few people. And on a debate on LinkedIn with somebody at the moment who thinks first order cybernetics can explain everything, right? And you can tell from his arguments that for him it can. Right. And I don't think there's any dispute that systems dynamics cybernetics is limited in terms of its ontological diversity. So it doesn't handle non-causal systems, which is what complexity is about. That's the big debate. That's the big split.
Am I also right in thinking that systems thinking has a rigid framework, whereas the Cynefin framework allows a lot more fluidity?
Systems thinking is one of those words. It depends. I mean, I actually have a chair in systems thinking at the University of Hull, which they gave me because they wanted me to stop saying it was different. Right. That was Yasmin. But yeah, the reality is systems thinking is used as this catch-all phrase for anything thinking systematically.
Right.
All right. Now, I think human beings don't handle homogenization well, we need to make distinctions. Right? And if you don't make distinctions, you can't get anywhere. Yeah. So basically, causal, non-causal is fundamental, because the way you manage it will be very, very different. Yeah. But you'll find people like Gerald Midgley and like who will profoundly disagree with me on this, and I'm used to them being wrong by now, so it doesn't worry me anymore.
I think you'd be quite formidable in an argument. So now we've got no more questions on chat.
If you don't know it, that's the Welsh tradition.
Well, yeah, I think Mal's gone on mute there, but I'm sure he's fine with you.
If we're being polite, we don't really trust you very much. I mean, that's the way it works.
Hey, we've got to be careful here. The Welsh could gang up on us, guys, you know. So.
I think they just did.
If you don't know it, 2/3 of the signatories on the American Declaration of Independence were Welsh in origin.
True.
We're natural rebels.
Dave, are you familiar with Dean Gano and Edward de Bono and some of the folks like that have? I see some strings that tie what you're talking about to some of the things that they've brought up.
See a lot. I mean, it's like Stafford Beer, who's in cybernetics. I have huge respect for what Stafford did, and I always say if Stafford had been born 30 years later, he'd never have created the VSM model. You'd have had a better science, right? And I think people like de Bono intuited different cognitive styles, but I think they come out of a tradition which pervades management and is deeply problematic, which is the pervasive nature of Jungian archetypes in the way that people think about people and organizations. Now, that's been bad science for about 50 years, but it still pervades the way people think, and de Bono comes out of that tradition. Yeah.
So we've got
de Bono got away from the thought of one linear chain going down to something.
And I say that's multiple chains going down. Recognize you need the differences, all right? I think the difference is, and I say this to some cybernetics, because they say, well, we talked about this type of system 50 years ago. And you say, yeah, and people talked about gravity, but then Newton came along and we talked about it differently.
Right.
All right. And the issue is we now know, for example, the idea that you have a conscious and unconscious, or you have a system level subconscious, that's just bad science. Yeah, we know it's not true. Right. So once you get the science, you can start to scale. It's what I would say, if you don't understand why, don't try and replicate a what. Yeah. And if you understand why in terms of natural science, you don't run the risk of correlation causation confusion or limited sample sizes.
Dave, you've got a question here from Jeanette. Jeanette says, I really enjoyed reading your article on Leaders Framework for Decision Making and Leaders Guide. I would appreciate a couple of words on effective leadership depending on the environment and business situation. Ooh, I wonder if you're going to touch on paralysis by analysis here. But anyway, Dave, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm currently working on this because we're doing several partnerships with people who've got different leadership theories. So we're supplying them software, but we need to make sure our version is distinct. I think this links in with something I was just talking about. Keith, there's this thing which came out of cybernetics and systems dynamics, which is either a process or it's a brilliant leader. And you can see that it pervades management structure, right? The reality is that's a false dichotomy, right? One of the things we now know is that the brain doesn't coexist. The brain doesn't define consciousness. Consciousness is a distributed function, not only of the brain, but the body, its social interactions. It's got high path dependency and so on. Yeah. So if you look at the way military handle this, they have things called crews, right? And a crew is roles interact with roles in predefined ways. There's always a pilot, but who the pilot is can change, right? So one of the things we're working on, and that's what we're doing with what are called nested trios. So we define 50 roles. We define trios between 3 roles. Then we have multiple interacting trios, and we're using this on mental health, for example, in the NHS shortly. Right, so you basically network the organization. The roles are called a coherent point with order. So the roles now have to access the formal mechanisms. Okay? So we're now starting to see leadership as a distributed function, and where you need formal leadership, it needs to be a crew, not an individual. Yeah, because then you've got higher resilience. Soft systems, I mean, I knew Peter Checkland well. That was the same university as me, Lancaster, right? And I think soft systems is kind of like the better end of cybernetics, but it's still in there. And your problem with soft systems is it doesn't scale. And I'll make this, anything which relies on a skilled facilitator working in a workshop ain't going to scale.
Dave, can I take you back? I'm just going to put the slide up. There's something I want to talk to you about. Let's see, go back to this. Can you talk about the Hawthorne effect on complex when you talked about safe to fail?
That's the problem with pilot projects. So, I mean, the research is complex, but the easiest way is the popular one. So they did a whole bunch of experiments back in the 20s in the Hawthorne cable manufacturers, which is in upstate New York.
It's about light exposure, isn't it?
Yeah, so they increased the lighting levels, right? People became more productive. Now, these days, they've now published a book called Light, the Secret to Productivity, and create a certification course in switching on light bulbs. Yeah. And then they thought they might be real scientists, so they actually lowered the lighting levels and people became more productive. And what they actually found is if you pay attention to people and do something novel, it always works the first time. And that's the problem with pilot projects. If you run a pilot project, it will nearly always work. Right? Simply because it's novel, it's different. It's the human factor that Terry was talking about earlier, right? So that's why in complex, we do parallel. So you take every hypothesis and you make sure if the hypotheses don't contradict each other, you haven't scanned enough. And then you run safe to fail experiments around each hypothesis and see what pans out. And that way you avoid Hawthorne effect.
In parallel.
Yeah, you've also got the political aspect. So if you invest a lot of money in a pilot, the organization ain't going to want it to fail.
No.
And that's a massive motivational factor. Yeah, and because actually if you run 15 safe to fail experiments, you expect half of them to fail. In fact, we actually measure executives. If a third of your experiments don't fail, you've missed your targets. And somebody said, well, that will mean they make sure that it does. I said, yeah, well, what's happened? What actually happened is they selected projects they thought would fail. Those often succeeded. So it actually acted as a disclosure device, yeah, of getting them to talk with people they haven't thought about before. So that parallelism is actually key.
Earlier on, you talked about modulators. Am I thinking too simply if I say then when we look at the 5 domains, we can think about a set of modulators for each of those domains then?
No, you can do modulators. The manageable aspects of a complex system are modulators and constraints. Modulators are a type of constraint.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Okay.
The minute you move into into either of the ordered domains, and remember the boundary between them isn't a phase shift. All right, you've got cause and effect relationships which repeat. So you don't need to think about modulators. You just need to find it. You need to find the root causes and fix it.
Right. I'm with you.
Yeah.
I'm with you. Jeanette says thank you, by the way, for answering the question. And do you want me to bring those other slides in so we can talk about the movement between apparatus?
Just mention something, Jeanette, because I don't know what sort of doctor she is, so I need to be careful on this. We're actually...
Oh, I know Jeanette quite well. She's on our stream team. Jeanette's in the same line of work as us. She's in Poland and very involved with leadership.
We're just starting a big
her original training is in medicine. She's a doctor.
Right, we're just about to start a big program on leadership in the NHS. Yeah, based on Cynefin.
Yeah, Mark, thank you for joining us. I know it's 2 a.m. there, and you're always very supportive. Go and get some sleep, and we'll catch up with you on the next one. Davey, thank you very much for some of the answers on the questions there. Right, so now, Dave, we've got these other slides. Do you want to touch on them very briefly, because I think these are, and I'm going to use your words here, keystone in terms of discussions for next week. Maybe not touch on the apex predator, but maybe talk a little bit about the fluidic aspects here, if possible.
You have to remind me which slide.
Oh, wait, let me put the slide up. By the way, there you go.
These are the ones I was just talking about. So these are how you manage a crisis. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you've got a crisis, you're in chaos. Your first move is to rapidly stabilize the situation. And that may mean draconian constraints. So if you look at what happened in New Zealand in COVID, they didn't know that a lockdown was the right thing to do, but they did a rigid lockdown because it left them more options downstream. Whereas Britain tried to avoid it for as long as possible. So by the time we did it, it was too late. So kind of like key factor number 1 in crisis management, a good crisis managers do this instinctively, all right, is you make some draconian decisions very fast to create stability, to keep your options open for as long as possible. Yeah. The one thing you don't do is say, oh my God, if only we'd followed best practice, we wouldn't be here. Because it may well be that's what got you there in the first place. So that's why move 6 is you say no. Yeah. And then the other ones we've talked about. So the move into complicated, the move into liminal. Yeah. If you just flick that over. Yeah. So there you've got, if you get it into apparetic, so you force yourself to think about it differently. Some problems go into complicated, nothing goes into clear. And the experts may move stuff down there later, but you leave that to them. You don't do it as a centralized decision maker. And then you get the conflicting experts, that's move 3.
I've got 2 arrows missing here, Dave, 4 and 5, which is moving into the
complicated, and 5 goes into the chaos liminal area. We talked about that earlier. So you've got hypotheses, you don't know what the hypotheses are.
So I'll tell you something, this stuff never stops engaging me from a cerebral perspective. Sometimes I feel like I'm going through a massive learning curve. I don't know if others feel the same, but I must admit I get enlightened every time I look at this. I'm just going to turn off the slide so we can have them all on, everyone on the show. So we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left, and I want to throw it out into some questions and maybe some thoughts, position it in a way for next week's session, all of application in terms of risk and safety management. So again, going in no particular order, but maybe start with Charlie, and maybe the call to prayers is ended now, Charlie?
It's ended now anyway, so it's not a problem. There was 2 things, and I hope I'm not going to confuse or muddy the waters at all here, Dave. You talked about in a recent video, and I think you mentioned it this evening, was this aspect of cognitive activation. I think you mentioned in a video where pilots become pilots when they put the uniform on and things like that. Yeah, and I've now, since I've watched that, I'm now thinking to myself, I behave slightly differently than when I'm in the office when I put my high visibility vest on, I put my hard hat on, and all of a sudden there's that change. So again, there's that practical aspect of what we're talking about, which resonates with me really, really well.
It's physical as well. I mean, I was doing field ethnography in a big steelworks the other day. Yeah, and the minute I put on all the safety gear and everything else, I can't think the way I was thinking before. I just can't think that way anymore. Yeah.
And the other one was that you mentioned a thing. I think you mentioned a thing called the apprenticeship model or apprentice model, and I think you felt that was a good model. I think that was one of the videos. I wasn't clear about where that fits in.
One of the reasons is that if you look at London taxi drivers, which is one of the first cases we found about physical developments, right? So London taxi drivers drive around the streets of London on a motor scooter for about 2.5 years. Until they know the name of every street, right? And the exam is to be given any 2 points in London, describe the route out, the route back, street by street. It has a 40% pass rate over multiple attempts. It's called the knowledge, and the hippocampus of London taxi drivers is significantly enlarged compared with other human beings. Yeah. In Australia, they don't let kids drive for 2 years after they pass their driving test with other than elderly relatives in the car, because it takes 2 years for the body and the brain to co-evolve to the point where you can drive and pay attention to a conversation. Right now, this is what we keep forgetting, right? This is the post-Cartesian concept of consciousness. There's a whole body of knowledge which takes time to acquire. When I did an apprenticeship when I was young to my father, right? He'd wanted to be a carpenter, but one day, his father, who was a farmer, got a bad vet spill, so he marched down to the school and said, which of my kids is bright enough to be a vet? And Dad got an apprentice as a carpenter and sent to Glasgow Veterinary School, and everything changed, right? But he was still a carpenter at heart. So I spent most of my childhood building boats with him and cabinets in a garage. And most of the furniture in this house I built, right? And I thought it was about 3 years before he let me use some saws and do some things, because I had to acquire all of the skills to do it. And we're forgetting apprenticeship systems. So it used to be, you used to get, I remember I got promoted, right? I had to wear a suit and I had an office. I actually thought I was different. In medieval craft halls, people walked tables.
Right.
And now that we don't create those ritual acts of passage, and we don't have those time periods. And the famous statement from Polanyi, we always know more than we can say. And I'd extend that to say we always know more than we can say, we can always say more than we can write down. Right? There's a whole body of knowledge which takes you years to acquire.
Right.
Yeah? That's what apprentice models do.
You're living in Charlie's rent-free brain. You see, I can see him whirring away. Terry,
great.
Terry, any thoughts?
I'm sorry, was that me?
Do you have any closing thoughts?
Oh, a million thoughts. I wish we had time to. Wish we had time.
It's always the case.
I know, always the case. No, I think what I see out there in industry is people longing for simple answers. And there are simple answers to some simple problems, but most of the ones that they're struggling with are not simple. And they're trying to make them that. And they're trying to come up with this linear, well, if you only do this, we'll produce this, which is our desired outcome. I had to make a presentation on a project one time. They gave me way too little information. So I made a flow chart and I said, project begins, miracle happens, desired results accomplished. And, they all wanted more explanation of that middle step out there. And I think that's what I'm getting out of this discussion is some of those answers to what it takes to make things happen.
An amazing example of that. I was at a board of a company the other day and they pulled me in because they were dealing with high levels of complexity and chaos with no precedent. Yeah. And we went through and said, oh, that's great. We'd really like to work with you. Now, can you give us 5 examples of where you've done this before and what you did? And you sit and you say, well, the whole point is you can't. Actually, that's what the big consultancies play to. It's simplistic recipes, and it's very dangerous.
Sell by examples. Yeah.
Exactly.
Mal, fellow Welshman, any closing thoughts?
Not at this stage because I've got another 2 sessions with Dave, and I'm saving the best.
He's keeping his gunpowder dry.
Where are you from, man? Where are you from in Wales? Oh my God, an osprey.
Yes.
Right, that explains it.
It's Neath, Dave, where men are men and sheep are very careful.
Yeah. So you have to realise the first thing anybody Welsh will ask somebody else who's Welsh is, where did you come from? We have to find a reason for a difference.
Of course, it's natural. Yes.
In the U.S., if you're a military brat, your father moved you all over the world. He never lived in the same place 2 years in a row, and people say, "Where are you from?" It's a very, very complicated question.
Take your pick.
Well, gentlemen, we've hit the hour, and I'm even more enlightened. Maybe I will swat up even more, and you're going to live rent-free in my brain again for probably the rest of this week, next week, and probably for the rest of the year, what's left of it, and probably even beyond that. I think it's very exciting, Dave, the Cynefin framework. I think the reason that I thought it'd be useful to have some colleagues join you, I mean, it's a shame Dom couldn't join us, but between us, we've got 150 plus years of experience in risk and safety management. We want to see how we can do things better in industry and offer, I call it discovery, novel approaches to things that people can really learn from. The whole show is based on connect, share, and learn. But
you
Dave,
bring people like Marion and Gary on because they've done a lot of work with Cynefin in safety. And
well, I mean,
Gary over in Seattle. So.
Well, the invitation's open. We can host a couple more people. If you're agreeable, let's get them on the show for next week, because we are getting into the real meaty stuff in terms of applications. So, would you be able to ping them and let them know and get in touch with me, and I'll Good. Now, all I've got left to say is thank you, Dave, and thank you to everybody. I think we've got one comment come in from Rakesh. Sunny and team, great session, real coup to bring Dave on board. Of course it is, and I'm hoping we can get him on board a lot more. And Terry and Charlie and Dom and everyone, is great to have them on the show. Delighted that Cass has been tabled as a real influencer of risk and safety. Look forward to understanding more. Wash hands. All right. So Dave, Charlie, Terry, Mal, thank you so much for your time. Please stay on a little bit while we go off air so we can talk a little bit more about things for next week. But other than that, I just want to say, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. And to everybody out there in the world who's watching but not commenting, and especially to all those who are commenting as well, thank you. Stay well, go safe, and catch up on Thursday when actually Gemma's doing a show all about risk, what is it all about, and so on. Okay, thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Sonny.
Catch up in a bit. Cheers. Bye for now. Bye.